Mr. Smallwood, we were talking a little earlier about your stay in New York. You weren't in New York very long before you got involved in political things. What could you say your work in New York with the Progressive Party, for instance, taught you about politics and about politicking?
Well, I ought to say this, that I went to New York. I left St. John's to go to New York, not straightway, but via Halifax and Boston, with the feeling that New York was too abrupt to go from sleepy St. John's in 1920, with a population of about 25,000 people then. Straightway to New York was a bit abrupt, and so I went via Halifax and Boston, gathering courage and experience, you see. Now I left to go to New York with two purposes in mind. Number one, to work on a newspaper, to be a journalist on the New York scale, in the New York style, to have the journalistic competence to be able to get and hold a job. It was a lot easier to get a job than to hold it. And the other purpose was to get in touch with the socialist movement. The socialist, not so much the Socialist Party, but the socialist movement. It was a movement of people, you see. So when I left Boston to go to New York with a lot of confidence, quite cocky, I felt now I could hold a job anywhere in the world as a reporter, as a journalist. I went straight. When I landed in New York, I went straightway, within an hour of landing, to the office on 4th Avenue. I can see the building now, a narrow building, but high, of the New York Call, C-A-L-L, Call. It was a daily newspaper, very brilliant, very clever newspaper. The editor was O'Neill. O'Neill had written a famous book, The History of the Working Class Movement of the United States. And the city editor was Paul, oh Lord, he had been the principal editor of the great book publishing firm of Macmillan in New York. Well, Macmillan of London and New York and Toronto and Australia, the great book publishing house, and he'd been their chief editor, who had to make the principal decisions as to what books they would publish. He would read the manuscript, you see, and on his recommendation, Macmillan's would or would not publish this or that book. And he'd got into a thundering great row with them and resigned. He was a socialist by conviction, and he got a job with the New York Call as its city editor. Now O'Neill, Lord, why do I forget his first name? O'Neill was the editor, and this chap was the city editor. I walked in, and the man I saw was the city editor, you see. And I dare say it was my accent. I wasn't American, you see. To them, I sounded more English than American, just as in London later I sounded American rather than English. And all the time I was just playing Newfoundland, you know. Anyway, if that had anything to do with it, I don't know, but I got the job. And I was put on space, so much a column. They'd pay me. But after, this was on trial to see if I could earn a salary. I did so well that they took me off space and put me on a straight salary. And I did wonderfully well. I was making between $40 and $50 a week. You know, $150 to $200 a month. You realize how much that was, even in New York in 1920? You know, I had gone to work as a reporter just 2.5 years before that on the Evening Telegram in St. John's at $12 a week. And it's true, before I left, I was up to $25 a week. And then on the Halifax Herald, I was maybe $30 a week. And on the Boston Herald, I was, $35 a week, 30 or 35. And now, going on the New York Call, the Socialist Daily, I was $8 or $10 a week more than that. An $8 or $10 raise in 1920, I don't care where you were, I don't care what job you had, an $8 or $10 raise in your weekly salary, that was something. Well, I did wonderfully well. Now, why was I anxious to get a job on the New York Call, not the New York Times, not the New York World, not the New York Sun, not the New York Post, not any of the great and famous newspapers known around the world by name, but the New York Call, because it was the organ of the Socialist Party. Remember, I had two purposes. One, journalism, straight journalism, to be a competent, experienced journalist, and two, to get in touch with my new religion. It was almost a religion, And believe me, in England and in the United States, even as late as 1920 or 1930 even, up to the coming of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the socialist movement in the United States, which was made up, it's true, it made up a lot of trade union members and trade union officers, but the heart and soul of it were college professors, artists, sculptors, actors, clergymen, professors, the intellectuals of the United States, you see, which made socialism in the United States as it had been originally in England. In England, the great Christian socialist movement. Charles Kingsley was a socialist, the great Charles Kingsley, And there were bishops of the Church of England and famous clergymen of the Church of England in England who were socialists. It was a great, what they called, Christian socialist movement. And the only branch of it there had ever been in Newfoundland was a Christian Socialist Club. I think I've told you about that. George Grimes was the leader of it, and his father was the superintendent of police. And you remember they were going to raid the Socialist Sunday School Club headquarters because they were meeting on a Sunday to hold their regular Christian socialist movement, you see. Well, in the United States, in 1920, and for some time after, until the New Deal, until Roosevelt's New Deal, the labor movement, the trade union movement itself, not just the Socialist Party, but the trade union movement, was made up of unions that never held a meeting of the branches without singing hymns and without singing the great classic songs tinged with the socialist tinge, Edward Carpenter's England Arise, which wasn't very American, but it was a great socialist song. And it was really to join the North American, the Western Hemisphere headquarters of the socialist movement, this great new religion. Believe me, it was as much more a religion than it was a political party. So to become a journalist and join the headquarters, the spiritual headquarters of socialism in North America, New York was my objective. So when I got there, of course, right away I joined one of the locals of the Socialist Party in New York. They had, maybe a couple of hundred local branches within New York. And I joined one of them. And, that was a very famous one. That was nearly all of them artists and authors of books and playwrights, dramatists, and the sons and daughters and grandchildren of some very famous American names, names famous in American history. So I went and joined the local. Then I volunteered, and I rather fancied myself as a speaker. You see, before I left Newfoundland, I had joined the MCLI in St. John's in 1917, I guess, or 1918. I must, as I speak to you now, I may well be the oldest person living on this earth who was a member of the MCLI. Well, from 1917, from the age of 17, say, or 18, to the age of 83, I've been a member of the MCLI. Now, that was great training. It's true they were only Methodists, and you had either to be a Methodist or to have been a student of Methodist College. I had never been a student of Methodist College. I'd been a student of Bishop Field College, which was Church of England, you see. So that qualified me, and I became a member of the MCLI. But in the MCLI, some of the great names in modern, 20th century and 19th century Newfoundland history had been members.
This was, I suppose, the training ground.
It was a great training ground for speaking, for public speaking. Sir Richard Squires had been a member, Dr. Solomon P. Whiteway, Dr. S.P. Whiteway. Oh, the names are, I think Sir Robert Bond was a member of it, and so on. Well, I had joined that and gone into it, boot body, boots and all, and rather fancied myself as a public speaker. God knows I was not a great speaker, but I was fluent. And what was more important, I knew I had confidence. I had confidence. I was a slave to books, to reading, a slave to the business of acquiring knowledge and information, getting to be well informed, you see. And believe me, if you become a socialist speaker, well then, in the 20s, in New York, you had to be well informed, because you'd set up your platform, which is something like a stepladder. Except the part, on a stepladder now is about that wide. You can, put your can of paint on it and so on. That was wide enough for you to stand on, and strong enough, and not so high up.
So you'd actually carry one of these with you?
Well, you wouldn't, but the party.
Would carry one to speak?
That's right. The committee would bring this there, and the law required an American flag be draped around it. And I would, believe me, hundreds and hundreds of times I would say, "We Americans." Was I bluffing when I said that? Was I falsifying? No. I am an American, you're an American, we're all Americans. We're not citizens of the United States, but every Canadian is an American. Every Mexican is an American. Everyone who lives in the United States is an American. It's the United States of America. You could say the Dominion of Canada of America. You could say the Republic of Mexico of America. We're all in America. So I could conscientiously say, now there was a certain element of bluff in it, of course, because your audience, when you would say, "We Americans must guard against, we Americans must watch for this," they would assume that you were a United States American. I wasn't. I was a Newfoundland American, you see. Yeah, and well, anyway, I had this feeling that I was a speaker, and I volunteered. Now, they paid you. They paid you, if I remember right, I think it was $5 a speech. You'd be given your itinerary for the week. You say 3 nights a week. You go to this place, you make your speech. The next night you go to this place, and the next night, different points, you see. And these were in public squares. I remember the first one was on 14th Street. The thing's called University Place, a street that led off 14th Street, not far from Union Square. It would be quiet. It wouldn't be too noisy, you see. And you'd report to the local headquarters. They'd be expecting you, and they'd march out with holding the stepladder, which would be folded like a stepladder, you see. And when they get to the right spot, they knew the spot, they'd open it up, and they'd drape it in the Stars and Stripes. And then the local secretary of the secretary of the local or someone would introduce you. And you'd get up and you'd make a speech. You had to take up a collection, because although you got paid a fee, I think it was $5, although I have a feeling that maybe it was increased, or maybe they paid speakers according to their ability. But I have a feeling that I ended up by getting $10 for a speech. That was a lot of money. Now, I was working in the day as a newspaper man and doing my loving work as a speaker for the party, you see. And in the course of your speech, you'd have some books to sell. You wouldn't take a collection. You wouldn't just ask them for money. You'd have books to sell. You remember I told you that I sold the first pamphlet. Boy, was I excited when they handed me a bunch of these pamphlets. What's So and What's Not So by John M. Work, a copy of which was the first socialist book or booklet that I'd ever read, given to me by George F. Grimes in St. John's, the son of the superintendent of police, George Grimes, you see. And here they hand me up this pile of maybe a couple of dozen books, you see, to sell. Oh, they sold, I think, for maybe 50 cents, you see. So if you sold them all, you'd take in $5 or $6 or $7, you know. And that'd be enough to pay the speaker's fee, which he hadn't set himself. The party had set the fee, and that's what he got, you see. And how excited I was and how I told them. I said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited. They've just handed me some books to offer you for sale. Now, this could have been just a sales pitch, but it wasn't. I really was excited about this book. I said, this is the first book I ever read in my life. I was 3 or 4 years younger than I am now. This is the book that converted me and to believe in socialism. And that, of course, aroused their interest. I think we sold every one of them. Well, this was discovered. The party would get a report on every speech you made, every meeting. How many people were there? How long, could the speaker hold his audience? Did he impress them? How many books did he sell? There'd be a report of the meeting. Go to party headquarters, you see. And the reports were good, with the result that they tried me down in the ghetto. Now, the ghetto had at least 1 million people, the east side of New York, the east side ghetto. Mainly, that was a great section of Jews, as they'd come in from Poland, from Russia, from anywhere in the world and settle, not speaking a word of English probably. But they'd be among all their own people. There'd be synagogues for them to go to. There'd be schools, where they could go and learn Hebrew and English, both, you see. And they were at home. And a great many Jews in New York then were socialists. I would say that over half the membership of the socialist movement in the great city of New York would be Jews. And they sent me down there on trial. You see, now they didn't tell me this. When I got my list, one was down in the ghetto, on the east side of New York. And I was just as much at home there as I would be on Middle Street in St. John's, And so from then on, when they got a report of how I got on with the audience, 2/3 of whom didn't speak very good English, but maybe 1/3 of whom did, and young people, and a great many of them were a member of the YPSLs, YIPSELS, YPSLs, Young People's Socialist League. This was the party, the Socialist Party would be recruiting young people in the YPSLs, and from that they'd be promoted to the senior party. But it ensured reinforcements coming up, capturing the young, you see. And they would be at these meetings. And I'd get into arguments. They'd heckle me and I'd answer back. Then they began sending me up to Harlem, the black section, where you could go for the best part of a mile in any direction and not see one. You'd be the only white person that you see. Not a living soul, but blacks. And they tried me out there. Then they tried me out in other sections because New York, at least at that time in the 20s, they, like in Newfoundland, when Irish settlers came to Newfoundland, almost invariably they came to a place where the people there already were Irish. Or they came from England to a place in Newfoundland where the people you know, for 100 years, 200 years, everybody there was English, or not so much Scottish. Scottish were mainly here in St. John's, you see. Well, similarly, in New York, when the foreigners, the immigrants, would come to New York from Europe, the Germans would be likely to settle in a place where the people already there were principally German. The Chinese, where the people already there were Chinese, and so on, you see. Well, they began sending me. After a while, I noticed it. You know, I took particular notice. They were sending me to the foreign tongue, the foreign nationality sections of New York, Manhattan and Queens and Kings and Brooklyn and so on. And I went to party headquarters and I pointed this out to them. I said, look, you know, you must have a reason for this. And they told me the reason. It was very flattering. Believe me, it was one of the most flattering things I ever had said to me in my life. The reason they were sending me to these different places was that I was completely devoid of prejudice, racial or color or religious prejudice. I was taught they were just people. I thought of that once when Sir Richard Squires told me that he was tone deaf. Squires told me one time, you know, he says, I don't know whether an audience is singing God Save the King or Yankee Doodle. I can't tell. When they stand up and sing, he says, I know that must be the national anthem. It must be God Save the King. But from the tone, the sound, he was tone deaf, you see, which must be a terrible thing. That's almost as bad. Not quite as bad, but pretty bad to be born tone deaf, almost as bad as being born blind. To go through your entire life and not have the supreme enjoyment of music, you see. Well, I was tone deaf in the matter of color prejudice, national prejudice. You see, it was around that time that I became a very ardent, I was a Protestant. And the Irish question, believe me, beginning with the Easter uprising of 1916, and years before that, was a religious question. Now, if you can overlook the fact, this is a stupendous fact. It is stupendous in the history of England and Ireland that nearly all the truly great leaders of Irish freedom, Irish independence, creating Ireland a republic on her own, practically all the great leaders of that movement were Protestants. Wolfe Tone was a Protestant, you know. Daniel O'Connell was master, he was not a Protestant, but he was master of his Masonic lodge. Great Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who married our Newfoundland girl, Pamela, you know, from Fogo, was a Protestant. But if you make allowance for that fact, it's a sort of eccentric fact. The overwhelming fact is that the people of Ireland who wanted freedom and independence from England to become their own country were 99.99% Roman Catholic, weren't they? I was an ardent supporter of the Irish independence movement. And I joined, when I came back from New York, there was a branch here in St. John's of the Self-Determination League for Ireland, clumsy title, not Self-Determination for Ireland League, it was the Self-Determination for Ireland League, I forget now. I know that Halley, W.J. Halley, the big wholesale dry goods merchant and real estate owner, the father of Paddy Halley, the grandfather-in-law of the present mayor of St. John's, Mayor John Murphy. See, he married a daughter of Paddy Halley, who was the son of W.J. Halley. And W.J. Halley was a very prominent a member of the Self-Determination League, and Pat Shea, P.J. Shea, the three of us on a Sunday. Oh, it was about a 2-hour walk. We walked on a Sunday, starting around 12 o'clock, to go into Kilbride and hold a meeting to form a branch of the Self-Determination League for Ireland. I was an ardent supporter of the movement there was to remove Egypt from the sovereignty or the control of the British Empire, Great Britain, the United Kingdom. You remember that during the war, and by the way, here's something that every Newfoundlander should know, and very few do. As you know, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and her whole empire, which included then all of the present Middle East and Near East, included Egypt, included Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, all that vast area was part of the Ottoman Empire, owned and controlled by Turkey. And they turned against England and the Allies in World War I. And the British, Lawrence of Arabia, yeah. But what people don't know, is that it was a Newfoundlander from India, the commanding general of all the British armed forces of India, who was brought to Israel with his troops, they being mainly Sikhs from India, great fighters, great soldiers, that captured Jerusalem. The troops marched on foot, they were infantry, led by their general on horseback, who marched into Jerusalem and were met by the Lord Mayor of Jerusalem, a Turk, an Ottoman, with the surrender. The man who took the surrender for the Allies, the surrender of Jerusalem, was our St. Johnsman, our Newfoundlander, General Sir John Stuart Mackenzie Shea. You know Sir Ambrose Shea, one of the great names in our history? Well, another one was the Lord Mayor, went over from Newfoundland back to Ireland. He was born in Newfoundland, but he went to the home of his forefathers and became Lord Mayor of Cork. Lord Mayor Shea, another relative, a very great Newfoundland family, very, very great. I was so proud that the first time I had an election in Newfoundland as Premier, and I organized the federal party's campaign, picked every candidate, federal candidate, for the Liberal Party of Canada to run in. I was so proud that my candidate that I chose for St. John's East, and he almost won. Imagine, St. John's East. He almost won St. John's East for the Liberal Party, was Ambrose Shea, called after the great Sir Ambrose Shea. Yes, sir. Well, it was a very great family. Well, at that time, I did not know that the capture of Jerusalem had been effected and the surrender of the city had been given to our fellow Newfoundlander, Sir Ambrose Shea. In Jerusalem, 2 or 3 years ago, I spent an evening, a fascinating evening on Mount of Olives in the Episcopal Palace of the Roman Catholic Church. On the Mount of Olives, can you imagine, in Jerusalem? Spent an evening there until late in the night with my fellow Newfoundlander, His Grace Bishop Carew of St. John's. I was able to tell His Grace the story of Sir Ambrose Shea. That you're not the first Newfoundlander here, Your Grace. Another great Newfoundlander was here in the person of General Sir John Stuart Mackenzie Shea. He had Scottish blood as well as Irish, you see. That's where the Stuart Mackenzie part came in. Well, I joined the movement. I was an ardent supporter of the movement for freedom for Egypt from English rule, from any rule but their own rule, I was a very ardent supporter of Gandhi. freedom for India. In other words, you might say I was naive. You might say I had a purely simplistic view. But naive or not, simplistic or not, as a young idealist and as a socialist, I wanted freedom for Ireland and for Egypt and for India and for anyone and everyone. I believed in national freedom and national independence, you see. Well, I never changed my view on Ireland, and I never changed my view on India, but I must admit that I was pretty well disillusioned with Farouk. Remember King Farouk? when Egypt did get her independence and Farouk was the king. Oh, heaven. However, that's why I got in that socialist movement in New York. I joined it, became active in it, spoke on half the street corners of Manhattan, a good many in the Bronx and a good many in Queens and other, and not only so, but in a presidential election, 1924, in the presidential election, when the candidates for the candidates were Al Smith for the Democratic Party. He had been the governor of New York State, and he was, I believe, now I wouldn't swear to this, he was the first Roman Catholic in the United States to run for president. And that aroused, you wouldn't know, but the Pope was there running for president. You wouldn't know, but it was a cardinal or an archbishop. When Al Smith, a Roman Catholic, who had been such a brilliant and successful governor of New York State, was running for the presidency. And if he hadn't paved the way, I doubt if John F. Kennedy, later on, who was the second Roman Catholic to run and who was elected president. The candidate for the Democratic Party was Al Smith, and the candidate for the Republican Party was John W. Davis, who was the lawyer for 60-odd of the largest corporations in the United States. He was the greatest corporation lawyer in that whole nation, you see. And the candidate of the third party, the Progressive Party, which was a combination of the Socialist Party and the Liberal Party, several parties a bit or a lot to the left. That was the third party, the Progressive Party. The candidate was Senator Robert M. La Follette. And of course, as a socialist, I went out campaigning in that election, 1924, for the third party, the Progressive Party, you see. The Socialist Party was supporting them. Well, and by the way, the candidate for mayor of New York, the famous Fiorello LaGuardia, he was a third party candidate for mayor. I was active in that campaign. Well, I made the famous tour of the state, of New York State. I think it was 18 cities. You make a great circle. You leave New York, you go here and then there, right around in a great circle. The last place up was not Schenectady, it was not Albany. It was Niagara Falls, American side of Niagara Falls, you see. And I made speeches, and two of the meetings I held were amongst the most exciting in all my life. Of all the thousands of meetings I've held in my life, at which I've been the speaker, these two were amongst the two, most exciting. One was in the city next to Albany. It'll come to me in a moment. Where there was a great Ku Klux Klan, powerful Ku Klux Klan movement. And when I got there, Buffalo. When I got to Buffalo, I reported to party headquarters, and they said, "Oh, we're plentifully blessed now. We have Frank Crosswaith here." I said, "You have? he was a Negro. They called him the Negro Debs. He was a brilliant orator and black. And now you're here. Look here, why don't we have a joint meeting? I said, sure. And they called in Frank, and Frank and I knew each other, and we agreed to have a joint meeting. And the meeting turned out to be, 8 or 10,000 people, a vast open square. And right surrounding our little stepladder platform, you see, were about 3,000 to 4,000 blacks. That's why I'm here tonight. If they hadn't surrounded that, I doubt if I would have come out of it alive. Because the whites and the Ku Kluxers, the Klansmen, were on the outer ring, you see. But even at that, a man with a revolver probably could have taken a shot at me and might have reached me. But anyway, that was a terribly, terribly exciting meeting. And the other one was in Poughkeepsie. Now, Poughkeepsie, or was that first one Schenectady? The one with all the blacks. It was either Buffalo or Schenectady. I wouldn't swear. But in Poughkeepsie, which is on the way back now, I was completing the circle, and on the way back, and the last city before reaching New York again was Poughkeepsie. And Poughkeepsie is where the famous girls' college is, Vassar College, where it's like a private school for the daughters of wealthy people, Vassar College. But as in all colleges, whether boys or girls or universities, you're likely to get a high proportion of students who are a bit left of center, idealistic and so on. There, a very high proportion of the girls were socialists, you see. So I arrived in Poughkeepsie, got off the train, and was met at the train by a man in uniform, a chauffeur. And he had been given a description of me, and he came over and saluted. He said, "You're Mr. Smallwood?" "Yes." He said, "I'm here to take you to your hotel." So I said, "Fine." Got in a big limousine. For a socialist, was driven to the hotel. It was called the King Court, King, K-I-N-G, Court Hotel, and went in and registered, signed my name, and was shown up to my room with my suitcase, and came back down and went over to the desk, and I said to the fellow, I said, "Look, I'm puzzled. I was met at the railway station by a uniformed chauffeur. You were expecting me. I was shown up to my room, a rather stylish room." So what's all of this? Well, he said, "Don't you know?" I said, "No." "Don't you know about Mr. King?" I said, "No." "What about him?" He says, "He's the owner of this hotel and 2 other hotels in Poughkeepsie. 3 hotels. I said, "One man owns 3 hotels?" He said, "Yes, he owns the company that owns the 3 hotels." And I said, "Does his car and his chauffeur?" He said, "Yes." I said, well. I said, "Tell me about him." He was born in Romania or Bulgaria or Poland or somewhere. He was a Jew. He came to America. He came to the east side, the ghetto in New York, you see. And he had a push cart, pushing the cart and selling whatever he was selling. He did well, saved his money, and until he had, maybe $100,000. He had a lot of money saved. Came up to Poughkeepsie and continued his work there, making more money, and bought this hotel, which he called after himself, the King Court. His name was King, which was an anglicized form of whatever was his Jewish name, you see. Maybe König or, German, or I don't know. And but he was a socialist. He was a socialist, born a socialist over in Poland or Russia or wherever it was he was born. Became quite a wealthy man, a multimillionaire, and continued to be an ardent socialist, you see. And so any socialist speaker who arrived in Poughkeepsie, was his guest, you see. So that was fine. I then strolled on, asked the clerk at the desk, "Where do I find the socialist headquarters?" And he explained. It was just down the street, 3 or 4 blocks, and I strolled on and went in. Well, before I did, I bought the evening paper, and here was a big front page story about a big clash, a big confrontation that was coming that night in Poughkeepsie, and I was in the middle of it. And Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt was in the middle of it. This was to be a great clash between Mrs. Roosevelt, who was the wife of the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was afterwards the president. This is Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt that years later I brought here to St. John's to open the new campus of the university, you see. And here I read about this. She and the daughter of Al Smith, former governor of Al Smith, now the Democratic Party candidate for president, his daughter, Nancy Smith, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the then governor of New York State. The two of them had set out from New York City to make the tour of the state for the Democratic Party, for Al Smith, you see, for the president. And they had got a papier-mâché, some kind of fabric, the shape of a motor car made in one piece, which fitted right down over their car, leaving a place where the front seat was and the back seat, so you could be driving along and you weren't underneath this. And you could stand up and make a speech. And their first stop on their tour of New York State was my last stop on my tour. We met in Poughkeepsie. Now you had to have a permit to hold an open-air meeting, a street meeting. You had to have a permit from the police department. And here we were going to clash. And so I went down to the party headquarters and said, here, what does this mean? What's all that about? Don't worry. Don't worry. I said, why not worry? Because he said, you have to have a police permit. I said, yeah, have we got one? He said, of course. We have a permit. As Mrs. Roosevelt couldn't have. They couldn't give a permit to two different meetings in the one spot. This is a great open square right in the heart of Poughkeepsie, you see. They said, don't worry, just ignore her. Ignore her. You've got a permit. We've got the permit. There'll be a huge crowd there. Just the Vassar girls will be 2,000 or 3,000. And there'll be 10 or 12 or 15 or 18. There'll be a huge audience. He said, and you've got the permit, and you're the only one with a permit. And she won't be allowed to speak because the police will come up, where's your permit? Now this was the wife of the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, you see. I was smart enough. I was politically smart enough to pay no attention to what these fellows were saying at party headquarters when they told me, ignore her, she can't speak. You've got a monopoly of it. You've got a great audience all to yourself, you see. And I said to myself, is that so? Is that so? I'll fix that. We went down and we got to the square and we had to wait 10 or 15 minutes, and by then the place was just jammed. It's the biggest meeting I think I ever addressed in my life. And there was a place where the speakers had to be. You could toss a biscuit across from my car to her car. Her teapot, the reason, by the way, I didn't tell you, the reason they had this teapot built to fit right down on top of their car, leaving space for the front seat and the back seat, was to taunt the Republican Party for Teapot Dome. The president and the government of the United States got in a terrible scandal over Teapot Dome. You've heard of Teapot Dome, haven't you? Oh, it was one of the great scandals of modern times in the United States, you see. And of course the Democrats were plugging this for all they're worth. And Mrs. Roosevelt and Nancy Smith were making a tour of New York State in a motor car built in the shape of a teapot with steam coming out through the spout. There was a spout up in front, you know. And here their car was parked, and here was my car parked. You could almost reach over, you know, almost. If Mrs. Roosevelt had leaned over one side and I over one side, I think we could have shaken hands. We were that close, you see. So I, with my police permit, you know, or with the party's police permit, got up and I made a speech in which I said, The law of Poughkeepsie requires public speakers holding public meetings in the open air to have a permit from the police. Here is our permit. I held it up. Now I'm told that Mrs. Roosevelt hasn't got a permit. And some people have been unwise enough to say to me, don't let her speak. But I represent the Socialist Party here tonight. I'm a socialist, and that's not our way. We want Mrs. Roosevelt to speak. We're desperately anxious for her to speak. She must, after all, we're all Americans. Again, you know. And I said the right of free speech. And we're not going to deprive her of her opportunity. And not only will she speak, but she will speak first. You see. Now I knew that Mrs. Roosevelt, if she could speak for 5 or 8 minutes, was about her limit, you see. And Nancy Smith was just there as an ornament. She was the daughter of the candidate for president, you know, Al Smith. So I knew I could answer her. But anyway, her argument, she thanked me. She thanked the Socialist Party. She says, I may not be a socialist, but I have to admit that they have instincts of generosity and liberal generosity and so on and so on. And I thank Mr. Smallwood for his courtesy. And then our argument was, and I summed up our argument when I replied, I said, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Roosevelt, for whom everyone here has enormous respect and admiration. But if not for her argument, for her, yes. Perhaps not for her argument, because what is her argument? Her argument is that Al Smith, you know, I've gone wrong. Al Smith was not the candidate for president. That came in the next presidential election. And Al Smith was the governor of New York State at that moment. And he was supporting the Democratic Party's candidate, who was John W. Davis, the man who was the lawyer for 70-something great corporations, you see. He was the Democratic candidate. And Franklin D. Roosevelt had been the Secretary of the Navy at Washington. And he was known as a great name, the name Roosevelt, you see. And her argument, I said, is this. She asks you to vote for John W. Davis. Why? What reasons does she give you? Well, for one thing, she tells you that Al Smith is in favor of John W. Davis. But might that not be an argument? Not in favor of John W. Davis, but an argument against Governor Al Smith? See, and so and so. Anyway, it was an exciting time. The next time I met Mrs. Roosevelt, her husband had died. He had become president of the United States. He'd become one of the great heroes of the whole world, the whole human race. He's one of my heroes. And he had died, and she was a widow, and I called on her at her apartment in New York City, and invited her to come down and open the new campus of Memorial University. And she was kind enough to say that she remembered that meeting. I have my doubts. To this minute, she would remember being in Poughkeepsie. She would remember all the Vassar girls that were there. She would remember the huge, because it was her first meeting on this tour around the swing around the state, you see. She would remember that, but I doubt that she would remember me. But she said she did. She said she remembered me. Well, that was the first time I actually, in my life, sat down and chatted with her. The next time, when the President of the United States gave her his airplane to fly down here, and I went out to the airport to meet her. And then, of course, at the opening of the, she opened the new university campus. And at the great banquet that night, I presented her with the gift of the Newfoundland government, the Newfoundland people. But that time I didn't make the mistake that I made when I presented the Queen, or the princess, before she was Queen. the present Queen of England, came here as a princess, and the government gave her a great banquet, and I was the chairman of the banquet, and I presented her with a stole, you know, and this was on television from coast to coast in Canada, I presenting the stole to the Queen, and I didn't have enough sense to I just offered it to her. Now, what I ought to have done was offered to, and she would, you know, put her shoulders, and I would drape the stole around her. I didn't have enough brains. I didn't have enough sense to do that. But I did with Mrs. Roosevelt, because I had so many people bawl me out for making the Queen sort of make the approach herself, instead of my draping the stole over her shoulders. When it came to Mrs. Roosevelt, I had learned my lesson, and I did drape it. And I have some beautiful photographs now of Mrs. Roosevelt with the stole being draped over her shoulders by me, you see. Well, that's a sort of long answer, isn't it, to your question? Your question was, how did I come to be involved in political activities in New York? And I think you asked, is that where I got my first training?
An actual political things.
It's not actually. In 1919, there was a general election in Newfoundland. And that was the one in which Sir Richard Squires became Premier for the first time, and I did not support him. I supported the Working Men's Party in St. John's West, Lineker, Cadwell, and Foley. Well, that was election experience. Of course it was experience, my first experience. I wasn't even old enough to vote, but it was pretty practical, down-to-earth political experience. And then I added greatly to that in the city and the state of New York, yes.
Why did you leave New York? I know that you wanted to go on, you wanted to come back to Newfoundland, you wanted to go on to England for the things that London offered. But were you tempted at all to stay in New York? You were doing well in the party there. Did you see that the party had limitations politically
No.
in the United States? Or
No.
did you just want to get back to Newfoundland?
Yeah, that's it. I wanted to get back. If I had left Newfoundland before the general election of 1919, before I got embroiled in it, up to my neck in politics, if I had left Newfoundland before that and gone to New York, I doubt if I ever would have come back, except sometime come back on a visit, come back on a vacation. But I was a very, very active and energetic Newfoundlander when I left Newfoundland in 1920. And there was, I landed in Halifax, and then in Boston, and then in New York, carrying with me the biggest map of Newfoundland, with one exception. The biggest map of Newfoundland ever made. It was made by George Turner, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Mines, the George Turner map, a handsome map of Newfoundland, but very big, very big. And I took that with me. Imagine I went across Newfoundland to Port aux Basques and across the strait to Sydney and then by train to Halifax, carrying that big flag. And as soon as I got a room in Halifax, I found a big place to put it on the wall. Then carried it with me on the train to Yarmouth from Halifax, and on the ferry across from Yarmouth to Boston, and then in the taxi with me to a boarding house, a rooming house, and put it on the wall. And then by train from Boston to New York, and from New York back to Newfoundland, I carried that map of Newfoundland with me. I had become almost a stage Newfoundlander, almost a professional Newfoundlander. And so, you know, the cat came back because she couldn't stay away. Did you ever hear that old saying in Newfoundland? For the cat came back because she couldn't stay away. And that was my case. If I had left Newfoundland a year, thanks be to God I did not, but if I had left Newfoundland a year before I did, I think I would have ended up by becoming an American citizen. I would have taken out citizenship papers and become an American. A thing that was done by tens and tens of thousands of Newfoundlanders. It's astounding. how many Newfoundlanders took out American citizenship, you know. And I wasn't particularly pro-British at that point. I was pro-American. I was attracted to America. America, it seemed to me, was the most desirable place in all the world. And England, aristocratic, snobbish, you know, no, until I went there. Now, when I went to England, I became the most ardent of all Englishmen, of all English empire patriots, and am to this day. It seems to me that the greatest civilization that has been developed on this earth, in all time, in all history, the greatest civilization that has been developed by mankind on this earth is the English civilization. Tremendous, tremendous people. Tremendous. Even if they lose their entire empire, if they lose their world trade, if they become a poor people, they will still be a very, very great people. Not perhaps powerful, not perhaps rich. You don't have to be rich and powerful to be great, you know. Either as a person or as a people. You don't.
I think that's about